November 23, 1942. On the frozen plains outside Stalingrad, two Soviet tank columns met at the town of Kalash, slamming shut the jaws of a colossal trap. In a stunning reversal of fortunes, over 230,000 German and Axis soldiers of the 6th Army were now completely surrounded. The hunters had become the hunted. Their commander, General Paulus, had been forbidden to break out by a direct order from Adolf Hitler, who made a fantastical promise. The army would be supplied from the air. For the men trapped inside what they would come to call the Kessel, the Cauldron, this promise was their only hope. It was a hope that would quickly turn to ash as they began a descent into a frozen hell of starvation, betrayal, and despair from which very few would return. Hitler's no-surrender order was not just a strategic decision. It was a fanatical decree born of ego. He could not psychologically accept the humiliation of a retreat, telling his generals that an army that retreats is lost. The task of fulfilling his impossible promise of an airlift fell to the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, who, with characteristic arrogance, assured his Führer it could be done. It was a catastrophic lie. The 6th Army required a minimum of 500 tons of supplies every single day just to survive and maintain combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's fleet of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes was worn out, inadequate, and completely unprepared for the vicious Russian winter. Vicious snowstorms grounded the planes for days at a time, and those that did manage to take off faced a gauntlet of resurgent Soviet anti-aircraft fire and Yak-1 fighters. On their best day, they delivered less than a fifth of what was needed. The air bridge was a tragic failure, a lifeline that was severed before it was ever properly attached. Inside the Kessel, the consequences of this failure were immediate and brutal. Rations were slashed again and again. First, the daily bread ration was cut to just 200 grams, then 100, and finally, to a mere 50 grams. A few mouthfuls of sawdust-filled bread that would tear at the insides of the starving men. Soldiers began to systematically slaughter their own horses for meat, but that resource soon ran out. They were reduced to boiling leather belts and boots to create a foul-tasting gelatin. The gnawing, all-consuming hunger became the dominant reality of every waking moment. Men became gaunt, skeletal figures, their faces hollowed out, their uniforms hanging off their emaciated frames. The once proud soldiers of the 6th Army, the conquerors of Europe, were now slowly and deliberately being starved into submission by the incompetence of their own high command. As starvation weakened their immune systems, disease began to rip through the trapped army with merciless efficiency. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of the basements and dugouts became breeding grounds for typhus, spread by the lice that infested every soldier's uniform. Dysentery was rampant, leaving men too weak to even move from their positions. The medical situation was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Doctors and medics ran out of everything: bandages, anesthetics, and basic medicines. Surgeries were performed without painkillers, the patient often just given a stick to bite down on as a leg was sawn off. The wounded and the sick were crammed into filthy, freezing cellars, often lying side by side with the dead and the dying. A German medic recalled, "The wounded screamed until their lungs froze. Then they just stared." For thousands, the Kessel became a place where a simple wound was a guaranteed, agonizing death sentence. As the physical body wasted away, the psychological fabric of the 6th Army began to unravel. Military discipline, once the bedrock of the German soldier, evaporated in the face of primal survival. Men would fight each other to the death over a dropped crust of bread. Airdropped supply canisters, the few that made it, would be swarmed by desperate mobs, with the strongest taking everything while the wounded were trampled. Suicide became a daily occurrence. Men, no longer able to endure the suffering, would use their last bullet on themselves. Others simply lost their minds, wandering out into the open to be cut down by Soviet snipers, or having conversations with long-dead comrades. The army was no longer an army. It was a collection of 230,000 individual survival struggles, a descent into a primitive state where every man was for himself. But just as all hope seemed lost, a sound from the outside world electrified the Kessel. It was the distant rumble of artillery. Outside the ring of Soviet steel, one of Germany's finest commanders, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, had assembled a new army group. Its mission was codenamed Operation Winter Storm, and its goal was to punch a hole through the Soviet lines and relieve the trapped 6th Army. On December 12th, Manstein's panzer divisions began their attack. For the men inside the Kessel, it was their last, miraculous chance. They listened to the sound of the approaching guns, a sound that promised salvation. The offensive, led by the veteran 4th Panzer Army, was initially successful. Manstein's tanks, fighting in blizzard conditions, smashed through the initial Soviet defenses and began a desperate drive towards Stalingrad. Day by day, they clawed their way closer. Inside the Kessel, the starving soldiers listened to the sound of the approaching battle, their hopes soaring. At its peak, the relief force reached a point just 30 miles from the edge of the pocket, so close that some soldiers claimed they could see the flares of the rescue force at night. The gap was closing. Salvation seemed within reach. The fate of the 6th Army now rested on one critical decision. For the relief attempt to succeed, the 6th Army had to launch a simultaneous attack from inside the Kessel to break out and link up with Manstein's forces. The code name for this breakout was Operation Thunderclap. Manstein sent a message directly to Paulus, pleading with him to initiate the attack, to save his army. He knew that the 6th Army, even in its weakened state, still had enough fuel for one last 20-mile push. But Paulus was trapped. Hitler had not explicitly authorized a breakout. He would only allow the 6th Army to fight to receive the relief force, not to abandon the city. Bound by his oath of loyalty, Paulus refused to initiate the breakout without a direct order from the Führer. The order for Thunderclap never came. The decision was a death sentence, and the final, ultimate betrayal of the soldiers of the 6th Army. Manstein's relief force, now overstretched, low on fuel, and facing furious Soviet counterattacks from a prepared Red Army, could not break through the final 30 miles on its own. The Soviets, knowing exactly what was at stake, threw division after division in the path of the German rescue column, bleeding it white in the snow. After days of brutal, futile fighting, with his own forces at risk of being encircled, a heartbroken Manstein was forced to call off the offensive and retreat. For the men inside the Kessel, the sound of the distant guns, which had been their only reason for hope, faded, and then fell silent for the last time. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished. They had been well and truly abandoned by their Führer. Their fate was sealed. Now there was nothing left but to die. The final agony of the 6th Army would be a slow, grinding descent into a nightmare of fire and ice, a protracted horror that would serve as the final, brutal chapter of the catastrophe at Stalingrad. To witness the final, agonizing surrender of the 6th Army and the ultimate fate of the men trapped inside the Cauldron, make sure you are subscribed to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling these vital stories.